Hello everyone! My written tutorial this month went over some of my concepts for creating a fantasy outfit. So, in this video tutorial, I'm going to go over how I paint a fantasy character. I'm basing this painting off of my sketch here. I went through several design concepts before settling on the one I'm going to use for this painting. I'm working on an 18 by 24 inch panel that I've primed using Golden's Black Gesso. My drawing has been transferred in charcoal, which pretty much stays put while I'm painting, so there's no need to seal the drawing before I start working. If you're impatient like me, this method works really well. I can pretty much start painting right away. Golden's Gesso is a ready-to-use liquid ground formula that provides a really subtle tooth that helps the paint stick to the surface. They do recommend that you apply at least 3 layers of this gesso if you're working in oils. I used to use their GAC 100, which I really like, but I'll admit that I prefer this surface over that one because it's not as slick. I find that I can take the first layer of the painting much farther without the paint sliding around. For this first layer, I'm focusing on painting a quick pass over the entire figure. I'm using Old Holland oil paints, which are very pigmented and stand out nicely on the dark background. You can see how I'm able to layer my paint by using gentle dabs. I'm painting what will eventually be a very bright figure on a dark background, and the danger is that I might end up lifting up my paint and that dark background will begin peeking through. The secret is to use soft synthetic brushes and a very soft touch. I like working on these dark backgrounds because I find that my figures actually end up brighter in the end, and I think it's because I have the black base as a value register when I begin painting. When the opposite was true and I was working over a white background, I found that my figures ended up not having the same amount of contrast. I decided to only transfer the figure from my drawing for this part of the demo. The nice thing about using the charcoal transfer method is that I can add anything else I want into the scene later on. I'll probably paint the background next and then save the griffin for last. Right now I'm working with a size 0 pointed round brush and a 1/8 inch angled shader for dabbing. This painting is going to be interesting to work on because the human figure is what I hope will be the main focal point in the scene. She's very tiny and will be competing with another figure who is much larger. I think her face is just about 2 inches tall. Normally I would work from background forward, but I was worried about her getting lost once I started painting everything else. So I decided to start with her while I have fresh creative energy on this painting, and to be sure she gets the attention she deserves. I'm painting the figure starting with her face, skin tones, and hair. In this case, I prefer working from top to bottom so that my hand doesn't accidentally smudge the painting while I'm working, especially since I don't really like using a mahl stick. Once I have a solid pass over those areas, I can begin to focus on the clothing design. I have my concept drawing to use as a guide, but I'm probably not going to follow it exactly. I like having it as a guide, but I also like having the freedom to experiment and explore other options while I'm working. As the painting develops and color is added, the design will change and evolve. One of the areas that I was unsure about is the transparency of the draping cloth. When painting cloth like this, I could either paint the figure first as if the cloth wasn't there, and then paint the cloth on top once the layer below has dried, or I could paint the cloth at full opacity and then paint the skin underneath at a lower opacity on top. I'm going to go with the second option in this case because I'm still unsure if I want the material to be like gauze or silk. I paint the flat fill in first, and then using long sweeping strokes with my pointed round brush, I can start to define each fold and wrinkle in the cloth. I'm going to paint the bodice of the dress in a similar fashion. Starting with a flat fill first, and then with my pointed round, I can add the smaller details, like beadwork and embroidery. I know I want the dress to be a subtle white color, but I'm unsure if I'm going to add any accent colors just yet. I'm going to keep this area monochromatic, using mostly white and Payne's Gray for now. Once this area has dried, I'll have the option to glaze any bolder colors I may want on top. So this was my first pass. I was able to put in just over an hour or so of work. Another bonus that comes with working on this gesso is that the first layer always seems to dry pretty quickly, and sometimes depending on when I start my painting, I can even squeeze in a second pass in the evening of the same day. This is very helpful for me and my current schedule. Being a mom, I can't really put in the same long working hours as I used to be able to. So I like breaking my working day up into shorter sessions. I actually find that I get more paintings done working this way than when I was putting in long 12-hour days. I definitely think it helps to step away from a painting for a while. So now everything has dried and I'm ready for my second pass of the painting, which is probably my favorite stage. I get to slowly start layering the more subtle highlights and shadows. I use more transparent pigments during this stage because I like for the previous layer's details to show through, unlike with my base layer where I tend to use opaque pigments like titanium white and raw umber that stand out more strongly against the dark background. For example, I use titanium white during the first pass of the painting because it's very opaque. But for this pass, I switched my titanium white out for a zinc white because I like the cool, subtle transparency of the pigment. You can see how I'm building onto the painting without completely covering up what I have down already. Just like I did with my first layer, I'm starting with the face and working my way down. In the first stage, I was mainly concerned with getting a base layer down, but in this stage, I can finally start to focus on the smaller details. I'm going to be using my zinc white for pretty much everything at the moment. My highlights and details are going to appear very bright, but when I start to add my shadows and glazing in the next pass, they'll be pushed back again. I only like to use zinc white when I'm painting very thin like this. The zinc white I'm using in particular is actually a mixture of zinc white and titanium white. When painted more thickly and on its own and not in a mixture, zinc white can crack, which would really only affect a painting that was made on a more flexible surface like a canvas. I don't have to worry about that on cradled panel, but just to be safe, I prefer to only use it very thinly. A lot of the outer edges of the character are rough, but I'll clean those up after I paint the griffin behind her. I'm not going to worry about details like painting stray wispy hairs around her head or adding more billowing cloth until more of the painting background has been added. The painting is set in a lush forest-type environment, so my overall lighting will probably also change slightly. I imagine I'll do some greenish glazes over the figure to help her seem like she fits in the scene better, but I'm going to save that for the final stages of the painting after everything else is finished. I'm using Old Holland's emerald green for the smaller beads and color accents. When adding specular highlights, I like to include small specks of color along with the white to make them seem more dimensional. So this was pretty much the second layer of the painting. I was able to spend much less time on this layer than I did on the first one, since most of this layer was focusing on defining details. Now that everything has dried and I'm on to the third layer of the painting, I feel more confident introducing some color. I'm going to add a little Italian brown pink mixed with alizarin crimson to give the figure some blush tones. I have another tutorial that goes over the color zones in the face, but basically the face is divided into 3 sections: the forehead and brow, which uses more whites and yellows, the cheeks and nose, which gets more red tones due to the higher blood supply in the face, and the chin and neck, which will have more bluish shadows. You can really see how the figure is starting to have some life. I'm going to paint the highlights back in using my titanium white mixture. I like how some of the reddish tones I just painted are only slightly peeking through now. In person, you can actually see each layer of paint sitting on top of the one below it. I'll show you a scan at the end of this video that will help show how the light passes through the layers a bit better than the video does. But in truth, nothing digital can replicate how the layers are perceived in person. As I move on to the hair, I'm going to define the shape of the skull a little better, so when I start to paint the griffin, too much of the figure's silhouette won't be lost. Some more highlights are also painted in. I'll glaze a unifying color over the hair once this layer has dried to get the color back. I scumble my zinc white mixture over the neck of the figure to soften the pigment I have down already. In the end, I really want the figure to glow. You'll notice how this flattens the details, but they can be pulled back out using my pointed round brush. I like the idea of layering transparent gauze-like cloth, so I'm going to add a bit of a bow around the clasp of the shawl. I'm also going to add a few more details like strands of jewelry running under the shawl and bow. I like to save the smallest details like this once I have most of the figure painted. This way I won't have to repaint the jewelry as the layers build. I don't like to layer material like metal the same way I do skin tones and cloth. I'm going to paint in my last highlights because after this layer dries, I'm going to focus on glazing some color back into the piece and adding my shadows and depth. The highlights are really bright, but that's because I know they're going to be pushed back. So now everything has dried and I'm ready to add the final pass of the figure for now until I start to work on the background of the painting. I'm going to start by glazing the hair using raw umber and a little Italian brown pink lake. You can see how those highlights are getting pushed back and everything is starting to look a bit more unified. I've been oiling out using walnut oil between each pass of the painting so the paint glides on very smoothly. I don't need to thin my pigment with anything. While previous layers focused mostly on highlights, this layer is going to focus mainly on pulling out the shadows and glazing. I create a mixture of green umber and Payne's gray for the shadows. Shadows take on the cast of the ambient color of the environment, and since this is going to be a lush forest environment, my shadows are going to shift more towards green. I can add a little more definition to the hair around her neck by lightly dabbing these shadows onto the board. I find it helpful to break the character into basic shapes when determining which areas will be casting a shadow. Even her outfit, which seems very busy at the moment, can be separated into shapes. I need to consider how the lighting would be affecting each of these shapes to give the design more volume. I've been blotting my shadows using my 1/8 inch angled shader. To define some of the edges, I switch back to my pointed round brush. After all of my shadows have been added, I can paint in one last specular highlight pass. This will be my last layer on the figure for now, until I start to paint the background. As I mentioned before, my ambient lighting might slightly change as the painting develops. I always like to add a unifying glaze at the end of each piece anyway, to make sure all of the elements feel like they belong together in the scene. So here is a scan of how this part of the painting turned out. Some of the figure, where the griffin will be overlapping, was excluded. I'm going to be painting the griffin live at the Fantastic Arts Conference in Salt Lake City, Utah next month. I'll provide a link below on where you can go if you're interested in signing up. I know this tutorial was mainly for going over how to paint a fantasy character, but I just wanted to quickly show some of the foliage painting so you can see how I ended up glazing a few layers of golden hues over the character to match the environment. Having an old frayed brush is great for quickly scrubbing in mossy textures. I like to put down raw umber first and then dab some green hues like emerald green on top. I went back and forth on whether or not to make this a daytime or nighttime scene, but I eventually decided on a daytime scene. Normally, I don't paint this way. I prefer to work building up the entire painting as a whole, but for the sake of this demonstration and the demo in Utah, I broke it up into sections. So this is where I'm going to leave the painting before I do my live demonstration. You can see why I painted the character with more stark lighting initially, so that when I glazed the color on top, she would still stand out. I'll probably still do a few more passes on her while I work on painting the griffin. I hope you found this tutorial helpful. As always, if you have any questions or comments or ideas for new tutorials, please let me know in the comments below. Bye!